Imagine being so messed up that you drowned the Spanish colonizers to test if they were truly immortal gods and waited for 3 days to see if they'd reassured. This is the story of Puerto Rico's fight for survival and freedom. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel because what's coming will shock you. Borikén. First, let's move into the northeastern Caribbean, where there is a land of the Taíno people called Borikén. It means the land of the valiant lord. The land is positioned between Hispaniola and the Virgin Islands, and it acts as the gateway to the Greater Antilles, like a stone sentinel protecting the Caribbean's palace door. If we go long before Spanish flags or fortress cannons, this was the Taíno territory. Hammocks were everywhere between trees. There was cassava bread baked over an open fire, and disputes were settled not with words but through a noble ball game, which is a sport where honor was everything and nobody screamed at officials because there weren't any. But what happens when two worlds collide together and are so different that it doesn't make any fundamental sense? Back in 1493, Christopher Columbus sailed back to the Caribbean on his second voyage. At this time, he was there with larger vessels, grander ambitions, and many more flags to plant. The Taíno people approached it with diplomacy, tobacco, and curiosity about the strange newcomers. Their first encounters were interesting, as initial meetings often are before history decides anything. Spanish officials officially colonized Puerto Rico in 1508 under Juan Ponce de Leon, who later became associated with the mythical Fountain of Youth expedition to Florida. And by 1513, Spanish prospectors discovered something that would seal the island's fate: gold. This wasn't mountains of glittering like El Dorado, but it was just enough to make a distant king impatient and want to grab it from the people who were living there. And when empires find gold, the indigenous people are the ones who pay the price. Encomienda system. You might have already heard about the name or the concept of encomienda in order to extract the gold that the Taíno people were forced into the encomienda system, which was a bureaucratic term for coerced labor without the freedom to refuse. Death was not primarily by sword, but by disease, forced labor, malnutrition, and other messed up methods. Early Spanish colonizers in the Caribbean frequently proclaimed that God protects us and Christians will go to heaven alive. Death is temporary, and souls are eternal. To the indigenous listeners unfamiliar with Christian theology, this sounded less like a spiritual thing and more like a declaration of physical immortality, which basically translated to them saying that we should not be killed. And then came the El Bravo, the brave. When his brother died in 1510, El Bravo became the most powerful chief on the island. He watched the Spanish treatment of his people, which was alarming, and it was only getting more violent again and again. He even began seriously doubting their claims, and that's where it happened. In order to test whether the Spaniards were truly divine and immortal, the Taíno conducted what might be history's first drowning experiment. Diego Salcedo wasn't captured in battle or executed publicly. He was politely invited to a regular river crossing escorted by the Taíno guides. And there's something bad happened. He was held underwater until he drowned. Christian doctrine held that Christ resurrected after 3 days, so the Taíno people wanted to test it out and waited clearly for 3 days to observe if Salcedo's corpse would miraculously come to life. However, nothing happened. The conclusions. Spaniards were mortal, and their experiment was complete, with the mortality scientifically confirmed by the indigenous people. El Bravo rallied the island's chiefs and launched the first ever recorded war in Puerto Rican history in 1511. If we look at history, it is estimated that the Taíno rebellion lasted approximately 2 years, during which El Bravo himself was killed during the conflict after roughly 1 year of direct leadership. The rebellion became fierce even after his death for around 2 years. Taíno fighters fought relentlessly through some of the biggest and most shaky terrains, while Spain deployed overwhelming advantages here with steel weapons, war horses, gunpowder, firearms, and the attacking mastiffs. Those were huge enough to qualify as a nightmare. The rebellion eventually collapsed under superior military technology, where Spain declared victory. But now you're about to see Spain's victory that came with huge consequences that you might not have even expected. Laws of Burgos. In 1512, in order to control all the damage, the Spanish passed the Laws of Burgos, which protected the Taíno people from the worst abuses. By 1520, the Taíno demographic presence had nearly disappeared from the original record. As the Taíno population collapsed hugely, Spain began importing enslaved Africans. Initially, not for sugar production, but they were also working for cattle ranching and logistics transports in Puerto Rico. Slavery fed military garrisons rather than the European markets. While Britain constructed a huge sugar plantation elsewhere in Britain, Spain already built fortress walls, and Puerto Rico became the military shield of the Spanish Caribbean, protecting the treasured fleets that were sailing from Mexico and Peru back to Europe. Santo Domingo had gold, Haiti developed sugar, and Jamaica generated huge amounts of profits. Puerto Rico had mountain soldiers and a strategic benefit. The island produced small-scale farmers instead of big plants, which was a difference that would shape all of Puerto Rico's identity forever. And then in 1542, Spain issued new laws attempting to free Taíno people as a desperate last measure to save a dying population, but the colonial bureaucracy moved way too slowly. By 1600, no full-blooded Taíno people remained in the official colonial record, and through their genetic and cultural legacy, it is so clear. Then, something interesting happened. But before we talk about how Puerto Rico became scattered, subscribe now because what's coming next will shock you. Tri-ancestry society. By the late 1700s, Puerto Rico had changed entirely. It came from a tri-ancestry concept. The place has Spanish fathers, African and Taíno mothers, creating a complex mix of free people of color, peasant farmers, and even small-scale planters. The Caribbean demographic recipe contained fewer enslaved people than Jamaica and more mixed-race citizens than Cuba. And then Haiti changed everything. In 1804, when Haiti successfully abolished slavery and destroyed France militarily, every slave-holding colonial power trembled with so much fear. Spain trembled enough to redesign its Caribbean policy completely. Madrid implemented the Royal Decree of Graces, actively recruiting European settlers. The whitening policy wasn't primarily about appearances. It was a counter-revolutionary strategy in order to dilute the potential rebellion. By 1815, Puerto Rico's population was hugely mixed with white minorities. After Spain panicked over Haiti's example system, democratic immigration and bureaucratic reclassification changed demographics entirely. It was 1898 when the white population percentage increased from roughly 20% to around 60%, which is huge. Puerto Rico became Spain's most loyal Caribbean colony, which was formed in the Spanish way. But even after so much planning and the whitening policy, I hear something that Spain couldn't erase completely. Whitening didn't eliminate African or Taíno ancestry from Puerto Rico. It only renamed people through the paperwork and social categories. If we check modern DNA ancestry, it reveals exactly everything. The genetic breakdown of 60 to 70% European, 15 to 25% African, and 10 to 20% Taíno ancestry. Puerto Rico still preserves the highest percentage of Taíno DNA in the entire Caribbean today because it never became a sugar empire. The mountainous terrain protected small farmers, and those farmers preserved family structures. Even the mother scared indigenous and African ancestry into future generations after the classification system. Puerto Rico employed the same Iberian character. It had a very strong caste system, as the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and a lot of Spanish America did, but they still managed to survive in some cases. The Spanish caste system was such that everyone got a rigid category. The British caste system had two categories, white and problem. Puerto Rico categories technically exist, but everyone is cousins to each other. The further experimentation. Now moving back to the 1800s, Puerto Rico experimented economically with both coffee and sugar production. Coffee was thriving in the mountainous region, and sugar survived, but it never really dominated. The islands produced more coffee beans than sugarcane. Slavery existed and was absolutely real, but it never reached the extremely industrial level that we saw in Cuba or Street Dominic. Puerto Rico also lacked the massive flat plantation islands, an export-focused economy that created slavery's worst horrors everywhere. It also proved that Europeans could be militarily defeated and that slavery could be destroyed. The Dominican Republic proved that Spain was beatable through those independent movements. Puerto Rico staged its first independence rebellion. On September 23, 1868, patriots raised their flag and declared the Republic of Puerto Rico in the mountain town of Lares. This rebellion collapsed within a few hours as Spanish forces quickly took control, but ideas survived longer than the government. Then, in 1868, the Grito de Lares rebellion fell simultaneously for both independence and the abolition of further slavery. It talked about political sovereignty partnered with moral transformation. But here's the irony. Puerto Rico, even though Cuba was the one that abolished slavery first, claimed independence before Cuba. On the other hand, Cuba struggled for much longer. Puerto Rico had a 10-hour republic. Cuba waged a brutal 10-year war for independence, starting in 1868. During this conflict, Spain faced increasing international pressure, particularly from the United States after 1865. The pressure came not directly through military commands, but through American abrogation, making Spain appear bad, the U.S. Diplomatic influence in Caribbean politics, combined with American support for Cuban separatists, created uncomfortable pressure on Madrid. Spain's response in 1873 was that they would end slavery, but there would be absolutely no independence because it would cost them extra. It was in 1873 that Spain finally abolished slavery in Puerto Rico, which was the last act of its crumbling Caribbean empire. USS Maine and the empire's end. While Puerto Rico got their independence, Cuba continued fighting to fight Spain for their independence from Spain. The USS Maine was stationed in Havana Harbor, meant to protect American commercial interests, when it mysteriously exploded on February 15, 1898. Spain was immediately blamed despite any evidence, and in April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. After the brief Spanish-American War ended in August, the Treaty of Paris forced Spain to leave Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Puerto Rico wasn't asked for any opinion, only ordered to surrender. When the treaty was signed, Puerto Rico passed from one empire to another, basically like a digital nomad. Spain had abolished slavery in Puerto Rico to prevent losing the island to American influence. Yet 25 years later, the United States took Puerto Rico anyway. The U.S. military kept Spain's defense strategy and logic publicly intact. Puerto Rico became quite important for naval bases to run for the Panama Canal. The Foraker, the Act of 1991, presented the vague term called unincorporated territory. In 1917, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens through the Jones-Shafroth Act. The timing wasn't even coincidental, because World War I required expanded military recruitment, so it was a win-win situation for everyone. From the 1930s through the 1950s, Puerto Rican nationalism violently collided with American colonial policy. In 1937, the Puerto Rican National Party organized a march in Ponce to honor the 1873 abolition of slavery. Police opened fire directly into the unarmed, peaceful march, killing 19 people and wounding over 200 others. None of the civilian marchers carried any weapons, while most of the victims were reportedly shot in the back while attempting to flee. It became known as the Ponce Massacre. The people of Puerto Rico have seen a lot of violence again and again, and finally, in 1952, it became a commonwealth, which is a political invention existing somewhere between colony and state. Do you think the Taíno people had it tough due to so much value in their land? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for videos where we uncover the horrific past.